Greetings, everyone. Today is Monday, September 14th, and here is today's Monday Morning Minute. Again, just a short video that will help orient us and make sure that we're all on the same page. But before we get started with sort of the business aspect, I do want to just acknowledge that there's a lot of pain and suffering happening right now. And a lot of us are dealing with compounded tragedies at this point. And I want to let you know that I'm thinking about all of you, and I'm hoping that you are safe and well, and that your families and friends are safe and well too. And if you need additional flexibility with assignments, with deadlines this week or in the coming weeks as well, please just reach out. This is a time when we really need to take care of each other and sort of recognize, right, that Maslow comes before Bloom sometimes. So yeah, just thinking of you all. So for today, I just want to talk about our upcoming readings in media. We have one chapter from Jones and Jones. It's a long one, but a lot of good information. And there's also a brief TED Talk, about 7 minutes, that I'm asking us to watch. And then we have our first critical response. And so I'll talk you through that as well. Okay, so just want to preview our readings in media this week. So in line with core practice number 1, which we talked about last week, this idea of building a positive classroom environment and building a strong classroom culture, the next several weeks we'll be looking at the relationship aspect of this. This is super foundational, and what I love about Jones and Jones, as I've said before, is that they're very research focused, and the research bears this out too, that we really need to build and maintain strong relationships with each one of our students. So as I mentioned, this chapter is a bit lengthy. I do think it's still worth reading as closely as you can. Some parts, specifically when they're giving just examples of ways to build classroom community, those you can kind of skim over. Those are just different strategies or techniques. I think they are really useful though. But just some things that I want to highlight from Jones and Jones chapter 3. First of all, Kleinfeld's research on what makes an effective teacher for all students. And Kleinfeld kind of circles around this this concept of a warm demander. So a teacher who has high expectations, but is also warm and nurturing. In fact, another term from literature that's kind of synonymous with warm demander is the no-nonsense nurturer. So this, I think they both get to this idea of we want to, of course, ensure that our students are learning and ask a lot of them, but we're going to do that with warmth, with deep care, and with love. And building on that, we circle back to Nell Noddings, who was called out in one of the earlier chapters from Jones and Jones. Again, she's a feminist philosopher. Her big contribution to education is this idea of the ethic of care. And so she's very interested in moral education, and this ethic of care for her has 4 parts, which are then described in this chapter. So modeling the kinds of relationships with students that we want them to embody and to practice with each other. Dialogue, which they define as any sort of conversation or discourse where the teacher doesn't have sort of a predetermined endpoint or answer in mind. Students need the opportunity to practice caring with each other, with community members, through service projects, etc. And confirmation, which I sort of read as affirmation. They need to be affirmed and confirmed in their value and their worth as humans. The authors Jones and Jones also talk a little bit about this concept of openness and how open do we be with our students in building relationships. And they kind of outline 3 different I guess 2 are extremes, and there's of course the middle path that they advocate for. But on one extreme, it's like I share absolutely everything, and there are no boundaries between my students and me. On the other end, there's just this cold boundary and this idea of I don't share absolutely anything with my students. My personal life, my own ideas, those are mine. That's outside of the classroom. And they, as I mentioned, advocate for a middle path, which they then go on to describe. So that's something I think helpful to think about when you read that section, and and think about the field experiences that you've had so far, the field experience that you're in right now. How open do you want to be with students? And the bottom line of this very detailed chapter is that we need to care for students and not just about them. And the authors go through so many ways to demonstrate that care for rather than just care about. And I think that's a helpful framing. So in addition to this chapter, I'd like us all to watch the Rita Pierson TED Talk, and it seems like some of us are familiar with this. It's a pretty famous TED Talk. Always worth a rewatch, though. And the title of her talk is Every Kid Needs a Champion. And where Jones and Jones are, kind of have the appeal of logos, for those of us rhetoricians out there thinking about like the logic and the research, the hard numbers, etc. What I love about Rita is she speaks from a deep well of experience and passion. And her message, I think, is a beautiful complement to what we're reading about in Jones and Jones. She talks about, for instance, that even though researchers are really interested in why some students are more successful in schools than others, and we can point to all kinds of things, including poverty, dropout rates, etc. She says one of the things we rarely discuss is the value and importance of human connections and relationships. And rather provocatively, she puts forward this idea that kids don't learn from people they don't like. And that has implications, of course, for how we conduct ourselves in the classroom. And again, goes back to this idea of the necessity of forming those strong relationships as the foundation of learning. Okay, so this week we have our first critical response. And so I explained this during our synchronous call last week, but I'm sure it bears repeating since you have so many things going on. But when we have critical response weeks, what I'm looking for is that you'll post your initial response to the prompts by Thursday, 11:59 p.m. And then you have between Friday and Sunday to come back to the discussion and post 2 follow-up responses to your colleagues. So again, it's that Thursday, Sunday structure when we're on a critical response week. And so for this very first critical response, and since we've been working with core practices and thinking about your core practice journals, here is the prompt that I have for us. Reflecting on core practice number 1, classroom environment, what are some observations you've made in your field placement related to classroom environment? What are you seeing? And then secondly, how do these observations connect to ideas and concepts from our readings/media thus far? So I would just love for you to share some of the stuff that you're seeing. Of course, you can anonymize it. That's probably helpful. And then make some connections, and even some disconnections between what you're seeing in your field placements and the kinds of ideas, concepts that we've been reading about. And please feel free to draw from, of course, this week's readings, that Jones and Jones chapter and the Rita Pierson TED Talk. But then if you're also seeing connections with previous Jones and Jones chapters or the Delpit chapter, etc., please draw that in as well. I think that'll be really helpful as we work through core practice number 1 and this idea of classroom environment. Okay, so that's the prompt I'd like you to respond to. And I'm going to navigate over to our Blackboard course and show you exactly what you need to do. So this is not our course. I'm going to pause and come back to our course. Here we are, classroom management. Okay, so from our homepage, if you go ahead and click on critical response groups, we're all in small groups for these critical responses. So you'll click over here. And then when you click on that tab, you'll only see the critical response group that you are a member of. Because I'm the instructor, I can see all of them. So you'll only have one option. You'll go ahead and click to open up and get into that group. You'll see your fellow group members. And then you'll want to navigate over to Group Discussion Board. And here within the small group discussion board, you'll see all of the critical response forums. They're all here, including the rubric that we discussed a little bit last week. And if there's a prompt, I'll list it at the very top. So that's how to get into the critical response groups. If this isn't helpful, of course, let me know. I've tried to make it as intuitive as possible, but it doesn't always work out that way. So yeah, for this week, we just have that first critical response after you've read the chapter and have watched the TED Talk. Again, I wish all of you a safe week. And I'm really interested to hear your thoughts about all things relationship building. So take care, everyone.